become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Global civilization is clearly on the edge of failure.
What are you really afraid of? Hast thou eaten of the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat?
The moral to be drawn from this nightmare situation is a simple one.
You simply have to turn your back on a culture that has gone sterile and dead and get with the program of a living world and a re-empowerment of the imagination.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Fundamental changes in society are sometimes labeled impractical.
Our birth, our death, our being in the moment, these are mysteries. They are doorways opening on to unimaginable vistas of self-exploration.
The contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creative life.
Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts.
The society is trying to cure itself by an archaic revival.
What account would we give of our stewardship of the planet Earth?
The world is not an unsolved problem for scientists or sociologists. The world is a living mystery.
I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel.
Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
My name's Connor Jones, and I'm a permaculture designer and educator. I live in Ojai, California, and that's about it, really, I suppose.
We understand you grew up on this property, and you've had a long journey of discovering how you wanted to engage with this landscape. Can you talk a bit about that journey?
Well, in the beginning of the journey of learning about permaculture and sort of getting into the work that I do now, I did leave here for a while. I spent about 4 months in Australia studying at the Permaculture Research Institute with Jeff Lawton, and then studied with other folks after that, and spent a good amount of time going and learning from sort of the wizened elders of the movement, and also getting a lot of diverse perspectives on how things can be done in different climate zones and different modalities. And I brought all that back here to this land where I had grown up and started to apply those things. And, I learned enough to really begin the process. And then much of what I've learned is now credited to experience. I would say a lot of this is context-based application, and I feel like you learn a tremendous amount along the way from mistakes and from just observing and being present to the cycles of nature that surround, and then finding your position in that as a steward. Sort of been the blessing of having land and growing up on land as a kid. And before I even got into this in any official manner, I was a gardener and raised livestock and was very interested in the outdoors, and even crafting small ecosystems. I loved building ponds and creating gardens of life in a very small scale. And then my interests that seemed very disparate when I was a kid, gardening and fishing and raising livestock, and all these things started to come together into a structural design framework that allowed me to figure out essentially how to design a habitat for myself. And it became a clear acknowledgement that human beings are one of the few species, if perhaps the only species, that doesn't live in a habitat niche within an ecology. Every other species in nature occupies a position, and through its intrinsic behaviors and activities, it is replenishing the ecological matrix that supports its position. whether they know it or not. And fortunately and unfortunately, we have the knowledge that we have, which can sometimes divorce us from our ecological niche, but I think it can be employed to improve the entirety of the ecologies of Earth. And I do think that we're natural born stewards, and our intelligence could and should be directed towards that. So I had this inclination as a child to grow food and to interact with animals and ecology. And so now it's become a formal career path, I could say, that is meaningful and addresses a lot of the concerns that I started to develop as an adolescent, which caused a lot of anxiety for me growing up in this generation and being pretty inundated with all this information about the enormity of the problems that humans have created across the planet and the damages that are being incurred ecologically and the threat to our continuation as a species. And all these things sort of culminated in my own mind as a young person entering the world and not really knowing what to do. Because if I become part of society, am I just hastening the decline of the ecologies of the planet and our species as a whole? So I happened upon a permaculture book. I actually hit my head on it in an algebra class. I fell out of my chair because I was leaning back too far. I was so disinterested by what I was learning that I fell into the bookshelf behind me, and there was a book on the shelf that drew my attention, and it was Introduction to Permaculture. It's like the 1980s, 90s version of Bill Mollison's book. And it was very, it was a moment of divine providence, you could say, but it really helped me to figure out where I was going next, because that was my last month of my senior year of high school, and I was pretty set on not going to college and not getting a job immediately, and really figuring out what I needed to do for myself and what the world needed from me in a more meaningful way. And then that book arrived, and it gave me a whole different lens of perception and direction. So, and it was nice because it had lots of really cute illustrations and simple language. So I was able to like immediately understand and implement some things. So that really set the course for me.
Did you go study permaculture right after you graduated then?
I studied under Jeff at the Permaculture Research Institute. Shortly after leaving high school, I went over there and apprenticed for 4 months. So that was like my condensed version of going to college for 4 years. You know, it was like 4 months. Here's the crash course in design, and then a lot of hands-on work too, doing the farm apprenticeship. We were doing a lot of things I'd never done before. So yeah, that was my fast-paced education.
What lessons did you learn when you really started to implement permaculture on your own land? Has your approach changed over time?
Oh yeah, my perception of what permaculture or even regenerative design as a larger lens is like, it's changed fundamentally, I would say, because what I thought I was doing was following a series of steps that I had learned from a book or from a 2-week course. And obviously those things are very useful and sort of set the stage for getting into doing things in physicality and practicing it. But as I said before, you know, I've learned way more through experience than I have through literature or the words of other people. And I found that there were certain like dogmatic elements of permaculture too that were like, you know, this is how it's done, do it this way. And then there were a lot of my teachers that were like, that doesn't even work at all. And they may or may not be right about that either. But I found that the more I studied from the experts across the world, I was able to sort of draw the similarities out of their approaches and see what felt like the actual practices that that transcend climate and location and can be applied anywhere. And a lot of those have to do not with the landscape or anything physical, but more with your orientation and approach to work. So, designing for efficiency and even your thought processes and your approach to implementation. So this deep process of observation and turning yourself into a person who is much more aware on a sensory level and is watching for cycles and seeing bigger picture interactions occurring that winnow down into these tiny little outcomes. So yeah, you have to have this broad lens to know how to act in the moment. So
you shared with us the other day that you went on a plant-based journey. Would you be willing to share your journey with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of messages in the pop culture narrative that I think are really just sort of superficial pointers at a deeper truth. And, one of the things when I was feeling this tremendous anxiety about the global situation was, well, what can I do? And it was, well, eat a plant-based diet, stop eating meat and dairy and all this. And then, being highly emotional as a teenager, you witness like the worst of the worst imagery of what's happening in factory farming. And it's like, yeah, I don't want anything to do with that. And obviously it's having negative consequences on just about every level of analysis except being able to produce a lot of cheap food for a growing population. Which there is something to be said for that, but it can't really sustain the way it is, and it's not actually nourishing, I would argue. But that said, there was no middle path, really. There was no set of solutions. It was just deprive yourself of this thing. And I found that there was a lot of guilt embedded in the whole narrative, too. And I've learned to be very keen and aware of narratives that coerce you into acting out of guilt versus conscious choice and full awareness of the circumstances and implications of what you're doing. But I felt like the popular culture environmentalist narrative was fundamentally based on a feeling of being guilty for being a human on the planet. And I think that comes from a deep divorce from our natural heritage as being people of Earth that are part of this ecology and have a role to play that can be equally as beneficial as it has been negative in recent history. I mean, if I started studying history of indigenous land management and the traditional practices of people all over the world, and somehow they had been able to stay in one place for a long time and not destroy everything. And one of the foundational management tenets there was an emphasis on a perennial polyculture of long-lived trees and diverse plant communities that really are what that ecosystem wants to cover itself with, what that landscape wants to be manifested as. And what I realized is that an inescapable reality of working in perennial food production systems and ecology as a whole is that animals are, that you can't have a system like that without animals. And the interactions of animals with plants is, that's how soil's created, and that's what essentially cycles nutrients in a way that can't be done without them. And the more I learned about the health benefits of eating animals that are raised in these complex ecological relationships and the nutrient density that you can get from them, the more I realized that maybe I should start to move in that direction. Plus, I was also encountering the practicality of trying to grow a diet that's based on carbohydrates. It's almost impossible to do on a scale that is self-sufficient. And I think part of that is by design, because we have this huge agro-industrial complex that has systematically destroyed small farms and now is using the media to train people to stop eating livestock, to stop eating animals, and that their diet should be heavy in these plant-based foods that no one can grow in their backyard. Corn, soy, wheat, potatoes. I mean, you can grow some potatoes, but a lot of the foods that are being touted as a good replacement for livestock are things that people cannot, and in some cases are legally not allowed to grow because there's a patent on the seed, you know. So there is this funneling, this ideological funneling that's couched as a solution to the environment, but is actually just furthering the damages and further stripping people from their own food sovereignty. So that's when ideas and ecological principles actually started to ground, and I realized, like, what's healthiest for me and the healthiest food system for me is the one that's permitted by the landscape that I live in. So for example, with no irrigation and no need for external inputs, I can raise pigs and sheep on this landscape without planting anything, without tilling anything, and without irrigating anything. And they will convert inedible plant material that in many cases would be a fire hazard if not managed. They'll convert that into high quality protein, fat, fiber, and simultaneously improve the soil conditions by their interactions with the soil via hoof impact, manure and urine on the ground, and then the pruning of plants, which causes them to grow back with vigor and sequester carbon. So it was like, actually the best diet for healing the planet was one that leveraged the native plant communities and having a form of domestic livestock to be an intermediary that makes all of this edible for me. Sure, I have a small kitchen garden and I've planted a lot of perennial fruit and nut trees and timber trees, and because I like diversity in my diet, but I've realized that the foundation of my diet could be high energy and nutrient dense fats and proteins from animals that are living a very good life, better than most, that die faster than most animals die, with compassion too. And after a certain point, it was a no-brainer, even just from the management perspective of energy in versus energy out. You know, you get way more calories out of a pig than you do out of your potato patch.
Were there any health reasons that influenced your decision to transition away from veganism?
Well, I certainly noticed this feeling of internalized hunger. And that manifested in a multitude of ways, but I would say, you know, in my own instinct and intuition with it, the biggest manifestation was it exacerbated my anxiety and made me more emotional and more volatile about what's happening with the world, and more armed with vitriol about how plant-based diet is the way to move forward. And it was almost like I was compounding this lie upon itself, because not only did I not actually have the evidence to suggest that it was actually a true statement, but my body was telling me that too. And so I was convinced to deny my own sensibilities, which is happening in so many different dimensions of our culture right now. But I realized that I shouldn't be eating 5 or 6 meals a day and loading up with as many dense carbohydrates as I can, and fake mayonnaise and fake cheese and fake this and fake that. It's like, why don't I just eat real food? And so when I did decide to start eating meat again, I was like, well, you know, might as well raise it myself. I'm not unfamiliar with raising livestock, so it was a big part of my life in my childhood, was keeping poultry particularly. But I started raising meat birds, Cornish cross chickens, and I quickly realized that those were not that much different than the conventional system in itself. Like, you can raise them organic and on pasture, but a Cornish cross chicken, the one that we all expect to get from the store, is pretty much an industry secret how those genetics are bred. And if you want to buy the genetics to breed them, they're exorbitantly expensive. So not only that, but they're very poor foragers. They reach 3 pounds in 8 to 10 weeks on an all-grain diet. Maybe 20% at best they can forage from really succulent pasture. But in Southern California, succulent pasture is it's a fleeting thing. So I raised those, we ate them. It was a successful process and I learned a lot, but I realized that it was still so input intensive that it wasn't sustainable or even regenerative by any stretch. Like the grain, albeit organic, was coming from a massive monoculture somewhere I didn't even have any relationship with. And it was mostly corn and soy. It's like, well, what's the difference really? And so then I started raising dairy goats and bringing them around the landscape to forage on wild plants and watching them eat this tremendous array of diversity and knowing that that milk is sort of like the cream of the landscape. It's a distillation of the nutrient density and diversity of the plant communities here. And so that really tuned me into what it means to be land-based and to become part of the landscape, because I drank goat's milk from this landscape for years and years on end, and I started to realize that my cellular structure is becoming a product of this intermediary animal eating native wild plants, and then my body is being built from that interaction. And it felt great. Like on a spiritual level, it was like it's a sense of lived oneness throughout your day. And that's really what this sort of lifestyle and farming practice and way of orienting yourself does, is it imbues this sense of unification that you don't really need to have this constant reminder through a spiritual practice that we are all one. It's like it just becomes written in your lifestyle. You can see it through all your interactions. And I think that may heal some of the spiritual ills in the Western model that we are facing right now. But then when my daughter was born, I noticed that she had quite a hankering for nutrient-dense animal products. And at the same time, I was starting to realize that I felt the same way, but I was filtering through all of this misinformation about diet that came from the middle of the last century that turns out was funded by the sugar industry. So, and the whole way through, my body's sensibilities were always right, even though I was looking at the science, which this is a new thing, is like, believe the science. I'm sure there's a lot of great science out there, and I know that science has really transformed human well-being in so many dimensions, but at the same time, just like anything else that humans conjure up, it is vulnerable to corruption and even honest mistakes. But anyways, I've more and more become attuned and have faith in my own innate sensibilities to guide what needs to be going into my body, which from there outward has changed my worldview tremendously.
Do you feel like the attempt to find oneness through spiritual practices, as opposed to just experiencing it as a given reality, is a byproduct of civilization?
Yeah, I feel that a lot of our connection with meaning as a species and as individuals has been lost because we've divorced ourselves from essentially the source of life. We live in this insulated world that's really, it's a forced function. It's not a permitted ecological function the way that most people live. I mean, you're living between walls of toxic material with air conditioning systems that are keeping it between 70 and 75 degrees all day, every day, with artificial light, all kinds of EMFs everywhere. This box that you're in to shelter you from your natural heritage and where you come from, of course it's going to force you to gravitate towards any sort of spiritual following that's going to help you alleviate some of that existential angst about, why the hell am I here? What do I do? Why am I so stressed all the time? This disconnect is becoming so ubiquitous and so problematic for so many people that they're either medicating themselves for it into this like numb oblivion, or they're just dropping out of the system and taking a risk and gravitating towards their innate sensibilities. And it's becoming very popular to do that. And of course, the pop culture and the ability to market that's being utilized, and for better or for worse. But I think, the whole Western sensation of yoga becoming such a lucrative industry, should I say, is partly due to the fact that we don't have any substrate for spiritual connection with life in our society anymore. And so we look for it, and we carve out time in the day to pay someone to tell us these practices that are going to help us feel better. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that I feel like as we move as a species hopefully back towards more sovereignty and connection, we'll start to see that those things become less and less necessary as we become more unified with our environment around us.
What is your relationship with death, and how has it been transformed throughout your journey through life? How do you interact with death on this property?
Yeah, death is it's definitely something that is encountered on a daily basis when you live close to life. There's no other way around it. When you live close to life, you witness death every day. And I would say that there's varying degrees of the way death affects me. The dead mouse I removed from a trap this morning is very different than shooting my pig, or pulling gophers out of a trap is very different than losing a loved one. So, we obviously place value on certain people and creatures based on the extent of our relationship with them. But it's relationships that create meaning for us, I think, in large part. And so when you lose those relationships, there is a bit of a scramble to try to hold together your reality. But ultimately, I think the embrace of death is a rejuvenating process that actually can strengthen and feed your resolve, just like it feeds the soil and the web of life. That's one situation where you can certainly look outside yourself and see how it's being modeled and bring that in, welcome that in. And, I think we live in a culture that's death phobic in many ways, and also very strongly attached to our stuff, and that makes sense because we're not connected to anything other than our stuff. We don't have that transcendent connection on a daily basis with life. So we're again insulated from the consequences of life ending and re-becoming. When I first started raising livestock and harvesting them, there was definitely a lot of nervousness around taking life and feeling like I wasn't going to be capable of doing it. But I reminded myself that many people have done it and do it every day all over the world and throughout all time. And there's other species that are doing it all the time. Killing and taking life is something that is happening all around us in every moment. And I had to humble myself and realize that I wasn't actually going to be preserved from that. Because I realized too that no matter what I eat, someone's killing something so that I can have a meal. And so taking responsibility for my life and the things that sustain me was placed as a higher value than my fear of killing something. And now I get to the point where I actually enjoy the process of killing something. I can say that, and it's not this psychopathic caricature of like, you know, the maniacal butcher. It's an act of reverence and gratitude and power. There is a serious empowerment in that you know, we can hide from, but I think it really is to our own peril to deny that we have that capacity, and that if we don't act upon it, someone else is doing it for us. And I don't think that there's anything moral about not killing something because you think it's wrong.
What is the story behind the first animal you killed?
Well, I killed lots of animals when I was a kid. You know, and there's something to be said for that psychologically. I mean, you don't really develop a sense of compassion when you're a small child. It's much easier to kill things with the squeeze of your hand, or if you're 12 years old with a pellet gun and you're shooting birds out of trees. Like, you don't feel the same remorse or gravity that you do when you're a more cognizant adult that has developed empathy and feels and understands that other forms of life have their own sensory experience too. So I killed a lot when I was a kid, but it was not really a productive manner. You know, it was just for entertainment, to be frank. And I know that that's a thing that children do all the time. They squash bugs, they catch things and overhandle them and they die, and it happens. And I'll say, though, when I was an adult and choosing to kill something that I was going to eat, first thing I started with was a chicken, I believe. And it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. And then I wanted to do it again, and ended up doing it several times in one day. And the thing about it is, like, you don't just kill it and walk away. I mean, you kill it, then you're plucking it, then you're doing the evisceration, and you've got your hand in its body cavity, pulling its organs out, sorting through this beautiful matrix of organs, and looking at this amazing structure and this highly technological design that's causing this one chicken to function. You're like, I'm going to eat that. And that's going to become the same complex of interactions and beautiful web matrices that are inside me. Like, that's pretty cool. But you don't get off easy, you know. You've got to do the work, and then you got to prepare it right. You got to know how to cook something appropriately to honor it too, I feel. And then I moved up to larger livestock, and it becomes all virtually the same thing at a certain point. The body shows you where the cuts are made, how the body comes apart. It's like the manual is written on the body.
Do you have advice for people who are interested in engaging with life through death for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, my advice would be to see someone do it who's skillful and aware of what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, and then can show you how to prepare it in a way that feels like the whole experience was a success. You know, there's nothing worse than taking the life of something and then trying to turn it into something beautiful and tasty and then just having it not turn out right. It happens, but it's better if you can avoid that. But yeah, I would say witness someone else do it, or multiple people, because everyone has their own style and technique with it. But I'd say it's worth having some guidance. So far, I usually have worked just with knives. So it's mostly poultry and small ruminants, goats and sheep. There is a place for guns, I think, for larger animals, for pigs and cattle, and even for sheep and goats too. It's you know, guns are an amazing invention in that regard, because you can take life in such an instantaneous manner that there is almost no suffering that's detectable. I mean, it's like life is over. And versus a knife cut to the throat, the slow bleed out of that. And because then, with empathy, you put yourself in that position. It's like, well, what would I rather have, Personally, probably a bullet. So that's something that I'm starting to consider more as probably the most humane treatment. The only downside to that is if you like eating brain, it's scrambled and has lead in it. So,
can you explain the difference between how you produce food and industrial plant-based monocultures?
Plant-based monocultures, they essentially, what's required in order to get a field of soybeans or corn or wheat is the wholesale destruction of the ecosystem that was there before. And so in my book, that's way worse than killing a single species or one animal for that matter. It's ecocide. It's the destruction of a complex matrix of life that's been there for millennia. And it's an untold number of unnecessary death for the simplification of Earth's terrain to produce one crop. And the only reason it's one crop is because one crop is what's economically viable. There's no ecological incentive behind it at all. I mean, the people who are touting plant-based diets and even have co-opted the term sustainable are the big industrial multinational agriculture companies like Monsanto, which is now Bayer. They did the nice merger with the medical industrial complex too. But, Monsanto and Syngenta and these big multinational gene editing, science-based solution sets that are just not actual solutions, but are really just another way of consolidating wealth and power and simultaneously making people sick and dependent on pharmaceutical drugs, which doesn't it make sense that the people who are touting the new sustainable agriculture system that uses untold amounts of chemicals and genetic modification to cover as much of the earth as possible with monocultures that make people sick has now merged with Bayer? They're getting into the pharmaceutical game. It's like, okay, something there is, I would have to deny my innate sensibilities, I'll just say, to believe that they're actually doing that in goodwill. So, I mean, and for these ag multinationals, getting people on a plant-based diet is the best possible thing they could do, because they can dispense with this whole inefficient confined animal feeding operation thing they've been doing and just feed the plant-based kibble that they would be giving to the livestock to the people. We're the cattle now. So, no, it's no solution, and it destroys soil. Hands down. I mean, the entire thing is antibiotic. You have to kill everything to grow one crop because nature will kill one crop. Nature hates that scenario. So, and for the people who are concerned about climate change too, a tremendous amount of the CO2 in the atmosphere is not from our tailpipes. It's oxidized soil carbon. These deep topsoils in the Midwest and all of the arable lands of the earth were storages for humus and these long chain carbon molecules that had been sequestered over thousands of years and held in topsoil. And then we run tractors over that soil and expose it to the sun, and that carbon is loosed from the soil and becomes a gas. And you can see the plumes of CO2 that emanate from all of the agricultural regions across the planet when it's the time of year that cultivation happens. There's this huge mass of CO2 that swims across the planet's surface. And in the summertime, when the corn grows up, you can see it start to draw back down. But every year there's still more and more going up than is being drawn back down. But we know now the fastest way to draw carbon into the soil and to heal ecosystems is through the use of animals and their relationship with soil and plant communities and trees. And then the grasses that cover the soil as a whole. The most productive ecosystems on the planet are grass, trees, and livestock, or wild mammals, grazing mammals. And those systems still exist today that have been feeding people for 4,000 years or more in the Mediterranean.
Can you describe why we should be skeptical of trying to use science in a reductionistic way when it comes to ecology?
Yeah, I think we should be skeptical of science, and that's part of the whole enterprise of science. Like, having faith in science is anti-science. You should be skeptical all the time. The idea is that you're proving yourself wrong through the scientific method, not backing up your own confirmation bias or your corporate agenda. And there's so many conflicts of interest and so much science that's being put out now that just doesn't really get noticed. I mean, I think there's a big difference between science and corporate science. You know, we can do biological surveys and soil carbon sampling and all these things that can validate and justify regenerative agriculture and these approaches that we're taking that are ecologically minded. That's easy. That science is pretty simple. But when you get into the dogmatic narratives that are coming out of corporate science, so to speak, these bought and paid for studies that influence the diet of an entire society and their worldview, that's when it gets where I become skeptical, because it's just like a new religion. And science's job was to dispense with dogmatism. So I would say, be even more skeptical now than ever of the motivations behind the people producing scientific papers claiming one thing that causes you to deny your own sensibilities and what you feel is right.
It's fascinating how dogmatic certain science has become, especially when you consider how much dietary science is essentially a mouthpiece for the Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah, and that's funny too, you know, because like epidemiology, you can't ever get a causal result. It's all correlation. So like with the Seventh-day Adventists, like they tend to have a very healthy community and live a long time, but there's all these other confounding factors that are like, well, they also don't smoke and drink, right? Like, so there's the healthy user bias, right? It's like, okay, meat causes cancer. That's one of the slogans of the plant-based science movement. But it's like, we're not looking at the fact that people who eat meat statistically tend to be also more inclined to smoke and drink alcohol and do things that are otherwise deleterious to their health. And also, we're not looking at the fact that there's such a tremendous amount of these cheap sugars going into people's bodies every day in an unprecedented level. So like, you can't do a large study and control all those other things. So, you know, to say that meat is causing cancer in people it's an impossible thing to actually say with any scientific certainty if you actually believe in science.
What would you say to all of the young people who are rightly worried about the future and want to do good things for the world? Going well beyond any band-aid solutions for climate change and collapse, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing something, say in your own life, that you know is deleterious to your health, but you keep doing it even though it's going to kill you, and it's so pronounced that it's you're sacrificing your quality of life on a daily basis for whether it's an addiction or a habit or a work environment that's polluted, anything like that, it's causing this progressive decline of your health, and you can do something about it. Oftentimes it's not actually what you can do about it, it's what you can stop doing so that it can resolve itself, because the earth, just like our bodies, will heal itself in dramatic ways. I mean, you can witness it all over the world where people have just changed their land management ethic and the earth just rebounds in such a tremendous vigor. It's the same with us, you know. So if I would say if you want to do something about the state of the world, change your orientation around needing to do something and pay attention to what you can stop doing first. And then from there, you can sort of simplify your life. It's like do away with all the unnecessary nonsense and distractions and things that are fed by our desires, you know, like wanting to have really sweet foods and decadent things and watching TV just because it's entertaining and social media feed just because I don't know, you'd rather not do something else that would be a more responsible use of your time. Like there's so many things that we're just doing as a condition that we can start undoing. And then our eyes will be much clearer to see what we could do that is founded in a truly responsible and meaningful and effective mode of action in our own personal lives. You know, there's all these people that want to change the world. And they want to bring down the, you know, capitalist corporatocracy but they're doing it through smartphones and their groceries are delivered through Amazon. And so how do we opt out of a system that we know is damaging us and the place that we live, and then find the few things that we can do in our own lives that we're actually in control of that are going to make our lives and the world better? And if you start there, if you take responsibility for your own life, your own home, your own interactions, your own bodily inputs and your outputs, I would say, then you start to create a model for what others might be able to do. And you start to understand the patterns of what healing looks like and what living in a holistic manner looks like, and in a way that's based on truth, around what's true for you, paying attention to your innate sensibilities. And you start to notice your whole world change. You get this different lens that you can then interact with things with. And a lot of the psycho-emotional static starts to draw down. You feel less anxious. You feel more in control of your life. And you don't feel like the whole world is headed towards a cliff and you've got to get out in the streets and talk about, you know, whatever people are talking about. It doesn't matter what the latest meme is, the cultural meme of this, that, and the other thing. Like, fix your life. Get yourself healthy. Up here, the whole thing. And then you'll know how to act.
The point of our project is, in a lot of ways, to challenge the conventional wisdom of things, to question the premises that our society has largely accepted without question, and sometimes those ideas are challenging or controversial. Why is it important to be willing to challenge the status quo, in agriculture but also within culture?
I think it's totally important. I think that it's really hard, it's much more difficult to talk about because it's not as tangible. Like, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, it's like, oh yeah, I see what that looks like. That makes sense. I can eat it, I can feel it, I can taste it. It's here. Talking about what we're getting into now is much more intangible and slippery. It's really hard to nail it down, but it is one of the most important elements of this sort of work, and the part that is oftentimes the difference between success and failure. Because with permaculture, we're not talking about just a perennial agricultural system. And this is the part that regenerative agriculture doesn't really incorporate, that permaculture does, is talking about how we create a culture of permanence. Because we're in this like fast food, fast world culture that's careening towards a cliff, and we know that's going to happen. And all agrarian societies that depended on annual crops rose and fell in a dramatic show of success and failure. But the societies that had a grounded ethic of land management and banked their success on trees, grasses, and livestock have been around for centuries upon centuries and have an intact culture and way of functioning that can weather all the storms. And we certainly do not have that on the cultural conversation level. Like we have so much divisiveness now that there's no way that we can really have a unified conversation about anything practical, which I think is partly by design. If you can't get people to have a conversation about things that are practical, using critical thinking and reason and logic, then you've got sitting ducks. But all of this, seeing it from the ground up, like the whole plant-based facade, I saw through that and felt the strength of realizing that I'd been lied to and that I could change that, and then I could be responsible for that. And I felt the physical results of that were positive. Then I'm seeing the ecological results of that, a flourishing landscape that gets better and better every time the animals pass through it. Then I start seeing all these other elements of the worldview that kind of stem from the same orientation that the plant-based orientation has, which is like, the earth is dying, there's too many people, we need to get rid of all of the structures and boundaries that get in the way of our creative freedom. We need to dispense with capitalism. We need to get rid of rich people because they're mean. This, like, it's very childish. It's a very adolescent perspective to have. I haven't really been able to refine it as well as I can talk about plant-based diets versus eating from complex ecologies, but you start to realize that the same people who have stolen our food sovereignty, they want to control food, water, air, how you can shelter yourself, the education you get, the money, the politics, and the minds of people, all the way through. It's not just having control over resources. So if you follow it to its conclusion, you can see that the goal of the people who are manipulating our generation is to make us emotional, stupid, ignorant to history, have no practical skills, be in debt, not be able to afford land, not be able to even know what to do with it if we had it, to hate our parents, and to fractionate us from actually having successful families and stable lives as individuals, as parents, and as the communities that develop from that. They just want us emotional and inarticulate and incompetent. And that's, the longer trajectory of that is like, well, we'll all just be moving into cities and not having connections with things that sustain us anymore, and that'll get handed over to the experts that have the science.
My own experiences with mental illness, for instance, track with what you're saying. And there's something to be said about how our entire environmental reality and modernity and the things we're given to make ourselves feel better, psychiatric medication, junk food, alcohol, cheap entertainment, they make us easier to control.
Yeah, absolutely. And another element of it is take all the men who are the warriors that are like the really strongly masculine, competent, capable men that would probably be really successful at whatever they set their mind to, and send them to these meaningless, endless wars in the Middle East. And then when they get back, they're so emotionally fucked up that they're on medication for the rest of their life. It's like, I feel like when you pan out and you can see the pattern of this beast, it's hard to say if there's anyone in charge of such a thing, but I do know this for one thing, working with permaculture design, is you set up a simple and stable pattern, and it becomes more and more complex as it develops. And that's exactly what we have with the current model of society. But its complexities are getting into dimensions that are going to cause it to self-destruct. And there's going to be a lot of unnecessary suffering along the way. Maybe it's necessary too, I don't know. I mean, that's the bigger question, but I do think that we are capable of being responsible for extracting ourselves from that model and instantiating a new one within our own lives. And that's what we need to do now if we care about that.
Can you share some cultures that you're aware of that have been able to live with a culture of permanence?
Yeah. Well, there's a great book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. It talks about the wet tropics paddy culture with rice production. It's China and all over Southeast Asia. That system's great. The traditional Hawaiian farming systems are amazing. There's a bunch of different names for the way they do that. And then in the Mediterranean, the Dehesa system and the Montado, which is a Portuguese system. Dehesa is in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. That's an oak and pig and pasture situation. That's where the Iberian hams come from, the most expensive pork in the world. And then there's all kinds of systems that have been used all over Europe forever, like these hedgerows with pastures with sheep and cattle, and then oak and ash coppices and willow coppices where they're cutting trees to manage them for fire fuel, timber production. You know, it's very simple stuff, but, you know, it was always oftentimes it was people who were growing and living in marginal regions. They weren't in prime farmland, so they developed these systems that had to be more resilient. What's another good one? Well, there's some pretty amazing stuff in the desert too, in Morocco, and people doing some fantastic stuff with water harvesting over a very long period, the palm oasis systems. And but anyways, there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
We just like to include that to show, you know, how many people have accomplished this kind of concept.
Yeah. There's more than you can even list.
Yeah.
It's most of our history.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was destroyed intentionally. So.
Yeah, make way for a bigger, more productive system.
Yeah, or to make slaves out of sovereign people. Just go and cut down their ancestral forests and destroy their agricultural systems, and then they starve, and then they come knocking on the door of the emperor's palace looking for grains of rice, you know?
What do you want to have happen to your body when you die?
I've thought about that quite a bit, but I haven't really ever felt like a clear decision. But
decide now.
Yeah. No, it's good. It might change. It might change, but
That's fine.
well, I like the idea of being buried. I think being as bioavailable as possible is really... So I would say this: bury me untreated in a shallow grave with compost around me, and then plant trees or vegetables, if you feel like it, on top of me.
Nice.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.